We have now come to chapter 12 of Daniel, the final chapter, and it's been a good journey through the book of Daniel again for me, and I hope that those watching this online have benefited from it. We'll wrap up chapter 12 today, and then in the next class we'll just are planning to continue on with the book of Revelation, but that's future here. Let's look at chapter 12 of Daniel. Keep in mind, again, we are continuing what began in chapter 10, and technically the first four verses of chapter 12, in a sense, wrap up the prophecy of chapter 11. So let's look at what is said here. At that time, and again, the time we are talking about is the time of the end. Go back to Daniel 11, verse 40. The setting is the time of the end, the events that really are kicked off with what happens in Daniel 11:40. And I might mention just again here that where I am today in late November 2024, Daniel 11:40 hasn't occurred yet. We're not there, which means that subsequent events in prophecy, great tribulation, movements of armies, etc., unfolding of seals and trumpet plagues, hasn't begun. Other than the four general first seals of Revelation 6 of false religion, war, famine, and pestilence, which have always been with us, but that's kind of a preliminary setting. We'll talk about that at that point. But we're not in the tribulation. We are not at that point. But in many ways, we can say that we are at in a time leading up to that time of the end when these events take place. But we'll know that. We will know when we are in that point. And as problematic as the world is right now, with the potential of a World War III, as many are saying, we aren't yet at this point. That doesn't mean we couldn't be there, at some point soon or whatever. I don't know. I'm not one, never been one to try to set time frames of 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. I grew up in the Church of God from age 12, and I've been through all the different scenarios of the end of the age. I've heard them all. And I've learned, one thing I have learned is don't set dates, and don't even try to set frameworks, okay? 5 to 15 short years, or whatever you might hear somebody say. That just, it doesn't work. I've come to the conclusion we should be ready and prepared, watching, understanding. We don't know the hour or the day. We don't want to be caught off guard like a thief in the night. That is true. But some of the other approaches, I've just learned it's best to stay away from that. And with my last paycheck and with my next paycheck, I will make deposits into my retirement account. And you should too. And so plan for the future, the rest of your life, while at the same time you keep an eye on the world and events. So that's my mantra, and I'm sticking to it. So at that time, Michael shall stand up. We've already been introduced to Michael as this powerful angelic being, one of what I call at times the archangels. He's big. He stands, he is the great prince, it says, that stands watch over the sons of your people. Michael is mentioned twice in the New Testament, in Jude 9 and also in Revelation 12:7. And so you see him elsewhere. He seems to be a leader, if not the head of the angels, as some seem to put it. But he's called here one who stands watch over the sons of your people. So he seems to have a very protective, dominating role over Israel, both the nation of the Old Testament and the Israel of God, the church today. And he occupies that role. He is said to participate in the angelic warfare that we encountered in chapter 10 of Daniel. And he is directed now to Israel at this time of trouble, which it says there will be a great time of trouble. It goes on to say, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time, and at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Now, in Matthew 24 and verse 21, Jesus makes the comment, then shall be great tribulation. And that's kind of what gives us this term of the great tribulation, a period of 3.5 years at the end of the age of great trial and testing. We also equate Jeremiah 30 and verse 7, where it speaks of what is called Jacob's trouble, a time of Jacob's trouble. Now, you know who Jacob was. Jacob was the father of the 12 sons became the 12, whose descendants became the 12 tribes of Israel. And so Jacob, if you recall, back in Genesis chapter 48, Jacob, well actually his name was changed earlier when he wrestled all night with God. Was it Genesis, chapter slips my mind right now. His name was changed to Israel. And then in Genesis 48, he puts his name upon the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. And yet he still has that patriarchal name of Jacob. Jeremiah talks about a time of Jacob's trouble. And it is an end time setting of Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 7. And so we equate this time of great trial that Daniel 12 and verse 1 speaks of. We equate that with this time of trouble, this time of tribulation. And it will be so powerful that it, unlike any in the past. Now, that's hard to imagine. When you read of any epic of history and great wars, World War II in our time, World War I before that, which were truly global wars, especially World War II, and the millions and millions who died. And we are still dealing with the impact and the after effect of World War II today. That was a great war, but there have been other times of trial, 30 Years' War in Europe in another period of time, the Crusades of another time. And we've studied different wars and battles from the ancient world. There have been times of trouble. There have been times of great famine. There have been times of great pestilence, the Black Death that swept through Europe in the 1300s. And those periods, there have been times of trouble that have been continent-wide, region-wide, worldwide. But this is said to be even greater than all of those. And with what we read when we were in chapter 11, and we'll see in Revelation with the outpouring of seals and the wrath of Satan, the wrath of God, the day of the Lord, this ending chapter of human history will be dramatic. It will be tragic. It will be controlled by the hand of God. Humankind will not be exterminated by nuclear war or any spinoff from that. That won't happen. When we read the Scripture, we can be comforted that humanity will survive. That's why, look, the scenarios, the environmental scenarios that are painted in a dire way today about destroying mankind, destroying planet Earth, they don't, it's not going to happen. Mankind will survive. This earth will survive. That doesn't mean that, environments can be degraded and problems, and, we should give a hoot and not pollute. When it comes down to it, we need to dress and keep and take care of our planet, but we don't need to be scared into, whatever fit we might be by dire predictions about climate change. It just, I've already commented on that at another time, or even nuclear war. I grew up at a time when nuclear war was the problem. All right, we weren't worried about the environment when I was a kid, but we had nuclear war hanging over us. We had fallout drills. We had fallout shelters in my middle school. And we would have drills as to what would happen should a nuclear bomb go off, like you're going to survive it by ducking under a desk, as some of the things were. But that was hanging over the world at that time, and I grew up with that. You're growing up with environmental catastrophe. The Bible shows us how it's all going to play out. And God's people will survive. Humanity will survive. God's purpose will endure. Daniel here says that at that time your people will be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. We interpret that to be the book of life that we can find in other locations to be described. But God's people will be preserved. This time of trouble is going to be a very difficult period of time. And it will parallel what we studied in the last class with Daniel 11, verses 40 to 45. And in that general sense, and much more that we will get into detail with in Revelation. And so this time of great trouble is paralleled there in those references. And it says then going on in verse 2, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. Now here's a direct reference to the resurrection. And we would refer to that as the first resurrection. In a sense, those who will sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. The everlasting life would be that of the first resurrection. The shame and everlasting contempt would be the later event described in Revelation of the lake of fire. We call it the third resurrection. Not explicitly mentioned, but an event that is there that would include those who will be a part of, would be the incorrigibly wicked. But let's focus on those who sleep in the dust of the earth and will awake. This would be a parallel later when Paul writes 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where the death is described, those who sleep, who are the dead in Christ. We understand death to be like a type of sleep, and to enter into that, out of which they will be awakened through a resurrection. And those who are in the graves will come out at that particular time. And so here's a very direct reference to it, and Daniel receives it in his age, in his time, in the 6th century BC. Now, again, by the time you come, this develops within among Israel, later Jews and Judaism, and as we have studied already, and we'll study later in the book of Acts, there were different camps among the Jews in the 1st century. Pharisees believed in a bodily resurrection, while the Sadducees did not. So there developed differing lines of thought about that. But here Daniel receives it, and it's a very clear for us in the Old Testament reference to a distinct bodily resurrection that for those who are the Israel of God or the dead in Christ in that way. Other scriptures give us more information that we would fill in on this particular doctrine or teaching in the Bible about the resurrection. But let's keep moving here. Verse 3, those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the firmament, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. This is a reference to the people of God that carries on with other references going back into chapter 11. Those who do perform mighty works, historically among them the Maccabees, but also the prophecy references those who fall by the sword, who are refined through trial and tribulation. Those who turn many to righteousness will be like the stars forever. And so this is a description of really us. We should take this to heart. We are called today. We've talked about that in terms of the judgment and the resurrections. The calling of those who are like that, those that sleep and will awake to everlasting life, we will be among those. And we're called today, in advance of this time, to prepare for the role that will take place at the return of Christ to live and reign with Him for 1,000 years. And we prepare today. through a life of overcoming and living righteously, preaching the gospel, supporting the work of the church. In that way, as we live righteously, as we are examples, and other sometimes even direct ways, as we live righteously, we will shine like the brightness of the firmament, reflecting the glory of God and the way of God, being made white, and be a part of a work, or the work of the church, in turning many to righteousness through the preaching of the gospel of truth, the gospel of the kingdom, the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to be to influence people in that way, and to be among those who are wise and understand. This is where we are. So Daniel is there's a summing up that is taking place here. The resurrection is mentioned, which comes at the culmination of these prophetic events. But then in verse 4, something is said. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Shut up the words, seal the book. We would take this to mean the book of his book, the book of Daniel. At some point, after this vision concludes, Daniel goes about the job of shutting up the words and finishing the book that we have now called the book of Daniel, is how we should understand this. And he said, seal it until the time of the end. Well, that's our day, and encompassing all these other events. Many shall run to and fro, knowledge shall increase. That's pretty self-revelatory, that particular verse, that kind of fits to a T our modern world. We run to and fro. We can jet anywhere we want. We are very mobile. Information, knowledge, data, goods and services can be transferred around the world, depending on what they are, data, money, things, instantly. All right? We all understand that. We all know that. And so with that in our mind, we understand this time. We understand where we are in terms of a very global world, a very global society. And so knowledge will increase. Where are we with knowledge in our world today? Where are we? Well, look at the internet. Look at the increase in knowledge, and it's continuing to expand. I mean, you and I are living on the cusp of a major change right now. I mean, for the last 30 years, it's been, wow, look at the internet. And you've grown up with that. I didn't grow up with that. I grew up with an encyclopedia on a shelf. And you pulled that off. Wow, there's a lot of knowledge there, books of knowledge. You didn't grow up with that. You grew up with it instantaneously on your phone and your computer, easy to access. And now we are moving into AI. And we're all beginning to understand and deal with that and what that means in terms of knowledge, growth, exponentially outside of the internet. And I know all the fears and all the concerns, and we're in the wild, wild west stage of the AI aspect of knowledge. I don't know, how far it will go. I don't think machines will take over the world. I don't see that because of, again, what I read in Scripture. Look at the futuristic predictions that are available to us and study that, be aware of it. I'll be honest, with a biblical worldview, I don't look at machines taking over the world. Now, technology can bring us to the brink of destruction, yes, nuclear and otherwise. But God's word is true, and it is, and God's prophetic narrative tells us what we need to know. We're not going to see these great science fiction things take place. Now, how far will technology alter human existence? I don't know. I mean, there are great predictions about uploading our brain to the cloud, so to speak, or, transhuman. I mean, this is a part of the discussion. Some of those discussions are quite scary. I don't know how far that will go. I don't even pretend to predict that. But I know that knowledge about that is growing exponentially. And when you look at what Daniel is told here in verse 4, this verse just keeps developing, knowledge increasing, people running to and fro. And it opens up whole new vistas in this. And so this is where, in a sense, the prophecy comes to an end that began in chapter 10 as we move into verse 5. Because it says then, so we have a natural transition. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank. And one said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river. This would put us back to chapter 10, and this first being that he saw. I said then, I'll repeat now, some think that is a theophany or a vision of the one who became Christ. Others don't. So there's among interpreters there's a distinction. I don't know that we have a firm interpretation ourselves in the church on that, but so we'll leave it at that. But that's where it returns to the one who's clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river. And one said to him, how long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? The eternal question. How long before it all wraps up? Before the end of the age, the return of Christ, the millennium, etc. Then I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. All right, now here's where again we see a period of time, times, and half a time. And we've studied that already in terms of the biblical record back in chapter 5. And we will see that again in chapter 12 of Revelation, that this is referring to a period of 1,260 days, or 3.5 years. Time, times, and half a time, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, and all these things shall be finished. And so here we have a time marker and a time delineation. Now we're getting into a section here that does have some more times and lines here, okay? But before we get to that, let me comment on, it says the power of the holy people has been completely shattered. Who are the holy people? God's people. It would be Israel of old. It would be the church of the New Testament. All right, so let's look at this futuristic. We're talking about the power of the holy people, the power of the church has been completely shattered. What kind of power do we have? As we study through the book of Acts, we find that the only power that the church had in the early church was the power of God's Spirit to go out and do the work, to preach the gospel, to heal, to raise the dead in some cases. Through prayer, the only power they had was God's Spirit in them, and collectively, the resurrected Christ doing his work through them. And that's the same today, and will be to the end of the age. But he says that power that the church has is completely shattered. Now, this ties us back directly to Daniel 7, verse 25, where we saw there that the saints are given into the hands of this persecuting horn, this little horn that comes out of the fourth beast. Okay? Comes out of the fourth beast. And we identified that as the papacy. And again, keep that in mind. We talked about that in the last class. This is a matter of helping to understand the interpretation of many prophecies, and Daniel, no exception to that. That horn persecutes the holy people. That horn seeks to change times and seasons, Daniel 7:25. And the saints are given into the hands of this persecuting little horn. And so, encompassed in this times, and half a time, which we refer to as the tribulation, there is a persecution of the people of God. All right? And so, we have again, go back to verse 5, the end of verse 5, or verse 6. How long shall the fulfillment of these wonders be? Again, the question, what will be the end of this? And this is given that it will be for a times, and half a time. All right, so I'm going to put on the board some lines right now. So we'll put this one right here, and we're going to call this perpendicular line Christ's return. All right? And we don't know when that is, but we're going to, that is our terminus. That's our end. That is when these wonders will be fulfilled. Okay? That's the return of Christ. Now, we have here a time called times, and half a time. Now, we know from Revelation 12 that this is referring to a time of tribulation and great tribulation, so you can put that down. And I'm going to put that down right here at the bottom. Okay? Here's a timeline that stretches out, and we're going to give this times, and half a time, 3.5 years, 12 months of 30 days each, 1,260 days, etc. And we're going to put down 1260. So at the end of this times, and half a time, we come to the return of Christ and will be fulfilled. Okay? So let's look at that right there. Now, verse 8, although I heard, I didn't understand. Then I said, my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? He said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed and sealed till the time of the end. Many shall be purified, made white and refined, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. Okay, now verse 9, again, has a lot in here. It's kind of the hallmark of Daniel. The wise shall understand. We're trying to understand so many aspects of God's purpose and prophetic understanding as we've gone through Daniel and other prophetic books of the Bible. The wise will understand. All right? But there, in this process, that would be also include this time of the 1,260 days, but even before then, there is a time of purification where people are made white, and that's a symbol of righteousness, righteous words and deeds, and refined. So not only made white, but refined. Refining speaks to a process where impurities are extracted from silver or gold, other metals, to be made pure. And that's usually done by heat. And so trial, times of difficulty, can make us stronger, make us pure, refine us to that. And so it's speaking of the ongoing work of God's Spirit when in and among His people here. But notice again, he says, verse 9, go your way, Daniel. The words are closed and sealed till the time of the end. Now we've already, verse 4, Daniel's told to shut up the words, seal the book till the time of the end. And then he says, these are closed and sealed till the time of the end. Now, what is that? How long does that mean? Till the time of the end. Oh, they're sealed till the time of the end. In other words, there are things that are not understood until the time of the end. Now, we've been going through Daniel, and I've given you all kinds of historical understanding that helps us to understand Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, and everything there, correct? And I've labeled it what we can understand from the Bible, from history, and the speculation. I think we understand more than Daniel did when he sealed up the book. I do think we do, as we look back on the history from the time of Daniel. Do we understand it all? No. And they're sealed till the time of the end. All right, so as I've said, well, I'll say it many times in Revelation, we're not going to know what some of those things really do mean until we're looking back on them, kind of like we're looking back on aspects of Daniel today. Always keep that in mind as a mark of humility so that we don't get puffed up with pride and knowledge. And I'll make one more comment. Don't get ahead of Daniel. Don't get ahead of Daniel. And if you hear some speculation from any source, in the church, other groups, other books on prophecy or whatever, and they ask yourself, are they trying to get ahead of Daniel? In other words, they think they got it all figured out. Timelines, dates, events, and all. Look, I could show you, I didn't bring them down, I could show you charts that I've got that have been handed down from others that kind of try to lay it all out. And that can be a useful exercise. But at the end of the day, I put down at the bottom as a footnote, possibilities. Or to what we based on what we understand now. Don't get ahead of Daniel. This is what I've said to some of my friends. Don't get ahead of Daniel. Things are sealed, and we're not going to know till. It's an interesting discussion, my good friend, I will say. That is an interesting scenario that you have in your sermon or your paper. It's an interesting thought. But you're trying to get ahead of Daniel. And the way I read the scripture, don't get ahead of Daniel. Some things are sealed. Remember that, and it will serve you well in evaluating sermons, speculation, well-meaning, noble, and sincere. And even me in that way. If I ever get ahead of Daniel, I hope that I can be pointed out to that. The words are closed. All right, so let's move on now. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Got another timeline there, 1,290 days. Let's draw that in here. It goes out a little further, 1,290. What does it say about it? From the time the daily sacrifice is taken away, the abomination of desolation. We've already studied that. Remember what that was? Antiochus Epiphanes going into the temple, desecrating the temple with an offering of a pig on the altar, and very likely, as the historians feel, setting up a statue of Jupiter, Olympus, Zeus in the Holy of Holies. Desecrating, abominating the temple, to which the Maccabees had to clean it all up 3+ years later. And so, but we're not at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, we're at the time of the end. There will be 100, from that time of this abomination taken away, there'll be 1,290 days. Let's go ahead and read on. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Whoa, got another one right here. 1,335. So let's go up here and put that line out here. It goes out further. All right, 1335. So if you've done the math, there's a 45-day gap between this line and that line, and there's a 30-day gap between this line and that line. 1335 to 1290 to 1260. We've already identified this concurrent with the tribulation, time of tribulation. We've got our perpendicular line here, which is Christ's return. And I'm showing you how we look at and interpret these particular numbers, these days, here at the very end of the book of Daniel. Now, there are other interpretations by other interpreters, evangelical and all. But what I'm going to give you is what we have interpreted traditionally within the church, just so that you have this. Keep in mind that all of them, as we understand it, all of them end at the return of Christ, which we don't know, but then we're into the millennium over here. So keep this kind of, so something happens here, and something begins here. This is the beginning of the tribulation. This, we are told, is the time when a daily sacrifice is taken away. What can that mean? Well, in Daniel and also in Revelation, we've studied and we'll study again, that the prophecies show that there certainly will be sacrifices. Will there be a temple? We'll talk about that later in Jerusalem at the time of the end. That's going to be a part of all of this mix that's taking place with the King of the North coming in and the geopolitical structuring of that particular time. But with 1290, it is referenced here as a time when an abomination is set up. Now, we're not looking for pigs and statues of the Jupiter or Zeus in a temple again. In fact, if you look at that Luke 21 and verse 20, in one reference from Christ, Luke 21 and verse 20, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Little different twist as we project to the end of the age. Jerusalem surrounded by armies. We just read in Daniel 11, in the last class, that this king of the north comes into the glorious land and encamps there. That's going to be armies surrounding Jerusalem. That will be, as Christ said, then know its desolation is near. Now, we've looked at this in the church in the past, and one interpretation has been that abomination of desolation here of Daniel 12:11 could be Jerusalem being surrounded by armies. Okay? I would reference Matthew 24:15 as well, where Jesus made the reference, when you see the abomination of desolation stand in the holy place, take heed. Those who are in Jerusalem flee to the mountains. So we've got that as well, but I'm telling you since how we have interpreted this. And so from that time, there seems to be a 30-day period when the tribulation begins, in a time of Jacob's trouble and Israel, and a complete geopolitical reversal of the current world scene. Because there are now armies of this power called the King of the North, or the Beast, as we'll study in Revelation, that have now come into the Middle East and have begun to make changes and alliances and begin to impact prophetically the whole flow of the history as it is developing at that particular time. Now, we have one other line to at least consider here, and it says, blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days, 1,335. Something begins at this point. In the past, we interpreted this particular event being the work of the church being shattered. Earlier, when we read here in verse 8 that there will be times and when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, these things will be finished. But the work of the church would conclude. This has been an interpretation that we've had. I would submit that could be open for further evaluation, but that has been at least our traditional teaching here. And then 45 days later, armies move into the Middle East. And then there's another 1 month period from this to here when with that we have now a power in place that begins what is described as Jacob's trouble or the tribulation. I want to turn to one verse in the book of Hosea. Have you gone through Hosea in your class yet? So this may be a review to you if Dr. Dunkel brought that out. As we have looked at Hosea chapter 5, verses 5 through 7, there's an interesting passage here. Hosea chapter 5, verses 5 through 7. The pride of Israel, verse 5, testifies to his face. Therefore Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with them. Now we have three references. Israel and Ephraim stumble in their iniquity. Judah also stumbles with him. Now we know Judah refers to the tribe, or those people who are the Jews. And today, in this age, we would refer to them as the state of Israel, Judah. Israel and Ephraim. Well, from our studies of Genesis, we understand that Ephraim, one of the sons of Joseph, inheriting that name of Israel, is paired with Manasseh. And in our interpretation of that part of the Abrahamic story and the promise, we've interpreted that those blessings put upon the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, are reflected in the abundance of power, wealth of the Anglo peoples, let's call them the English-speaking nations of the modern world, led by Great Britain and America historically. And that is a part of our prophetic narrative. We'll study that more when we get to the promises of Abraham. And so as we look at this here, we have interpreted that to be possibly meaning that America, Britain, the entire English-speaking world, which would include Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and contiguous states probably, will be brought and stumble in their iniquity. And this time of Jacob's trouble, this time of revisiting of God's displeasure with the peoples of the Abrahamic descent through Joseph, receiving this time of Jacob's trouble. And so possibly, and it goes on to say, let's just read the rest of this, verse 6, with their flocks and herds they shall go to seek the Lord, but they shall not find him. He has withdrawn himself from them. Verse 7, for they have dealt treacherously with the Lord, for they have begotten pagan children. Kind of a commentary on morality, culture in our world, and especially the English-speaking nations. And it says, now a new moon shall devour them and their heritage. A new moon. 30 days. A month. From one new moon to the next, we're looking at 30 days. So, could it be that Hosea 5 to 7, is giving us an indication or a hint that the difference between 1290 and 1260 could be a period when the complete collapse of the English-speaking nations in the modern world comes about, and we have now the rise of this beast power that incites a tribulation for 3.5 years, terminating in the return of Christ. That's been our traditional teaching and understanding on that. Now, a lot more that we could say and go into that. I do want to point out here, before the conclusion of our class, that the one thing we know is this line here, Christ's return. And this is pretty fixed. This gives us specificity, this less so. And so, as we seek to put this together, a blessing to those who come to the end of the 1335 days. I will tell you, other interpreters, evangelical Protestant scholars for a long period of time, they take these two and they flip them and they put them into the millennium. Follow me? Blessing to them who comes to the end of the 1335, and they say that Christ returns, and then 1335 days later, it comes to that period of blessing. And they have various interpretations as to what might happen during that time. The wedding supper is one of them for some, all right? And other things. So they interpret these two over here, after Christ's return into the millennium. Everybody brings this one to the close at Christ's return. This is not our interpretation, so I'll kind of cross that out there. Now, as we saw in the 70 weeks prophecy, we do have an interpretation that the last half week of Daniel's 70th week will be fulfilled, in other words, 3.5 years in this period of time. But we take that out of the 70 weeks prophecy in our particular interpretation in that, as we saw. And so, but when it comes to these days of Daniel 12, this is where we are here, all of them happening, in a sense, this side of the second coming, and chronicling certain events, and then Christ returns. And then we're into the 1,000-year period. That is a lot to kind of digest, but they're thrown in here. Oh, it's almost like we've had a lot of images of horns and heads and beasts. Well, let's just give them a little bit more to think about as God sums it up with Daniel. And Then we come to the last verse, verse 13. But you, go your way till the end. I love that phrase. You go your way till the end. And that's probably the best message for us all to have as we conclude our study of Daniel. Go your way. Live your life. Be refined, be made white. Continue to live with light, wisdom, and understanding. We saw back in Daniel chapter 5. The hallmark of description of Daniel. He was one in whom was light, wisdom, and understanding. Go your way till the end, Daniel is told. We don't know how many more years he lived. We don't know how many years all of us will go on, but we are to go our way. To go our way. Live our life. You live your life. You become whatever you are going to be. Career-wise, work-wise, family-wise, person-wise. You fulfill your life and you live it till the end. It could be the end of the age, if it happens in our lifetime, or it could be then the end of our life, when that would come. We don't dwell on that until you get to my age. Then you kind of think about it a little bit more at my point in life, but you're not thinking necessarily that way. So go your way till the end. For you shall rest and will arise in your inheritance at the end of the days. We'll study more about that inheritance in the book of Revelation. There is a reward to us all for our lives called as first fruits today. It is the promise to Daniel. I love that phrase as it sums up the book. Go your way till the end. And if we can take that as a model and how to live and keep our eyes on this world, keep our eyes on the Word of God, keep our eyes on our own lives and coordinating all of that together, then when we do rest, we can be assured that we will arise in our inheritance that God will bring with Christ's coming at the end of the days. And that's good advice that God gave to Daniel. It's passed on as very good advice for us here. That brings us to the end of the book. It's always kind of a rewarding time to come to that. And we will begin our study in our next class into the book of Revelation, and which kind of follows right on in ways that will be shown at that particular time. So that is a time for us all to go our way, because it is the end of the class.